Comparing Communism and Fascism, Part 7, The Importance of the Leader. Historian Vladimir Tismanu observes that communist regimes were less reliant on cults of personality when compared to fascist regimes. Rather, the communists relied more on a cult of the party. Quote, "The myth of the party, more than the myth of the leader, explains the longevity and endurance of the Leninist project," unquote. Indeed, Tismanu notes that a key flaw in the lifespan of the fascist project was that it focused more on the charisma of the leader, the Führerprinzip, whereas the communists utilized, quote, "the institutionalization of charisma," unquote, in the form of the party. Furthermore, Marx and Engels themselves made the argument that the Communist Party should not become beholden to particular leaders. However, despite protestations to the contrary, most communist regimes nevertheless relied heavily upon cults of personality. Communist cults of personality can trace themselves back to the personage of Lenin, an extremely charismatic man and an intelligent writer. Lenin was well versed in the writings of Marx and Engels. Historian Robert Gelately describes Lenin as, quote, "a heartless and ambitious individual who was self-righteous in claiming to know what was good for humanity, brutal in his attempt to subject his own people to radical social transformation, and convinced he held the key to the eventual overthrow of global capitalism and the establishment of world communism," unquote. Lenin famously, as discussed previously, advocated for the Communist Party to be tightly organized and regimented. The party needed to be the vanguard of the revolution, and thus demanded absolute loyalty from all members towards a singular party line. This party line would be largely determined by Lenin himself and his disciples. As the head of the Bolshevik Party, quote, "Lenin was the embodiment of the theory and the struggle and the party," unquote. From the very beginning, the cult of Lenin was pervasive. Vladimir Mayakovsky was a Ukrainian-born poet who became a key figure in Russian futurism. Mayakovsky helped to produce propaganda for the Soviet regime, including editing the journal Left from the Arts, or LEF. The purpose of this journal was to, quote, "re-examine the ideology and practices of so-called leftist art and to abandon individualism to increase art's value for developing communism," unquote. Mayakovsky was committed to reshaping art for the purposes of communist propaganda. Mayakovsky allegedly committed suicide in 1930 under suspicious circumstances. The officer who was investigating the incident was later found dead. While he was alive, though, Mayakovsky wrote a poem in glowing terms about Lenin and his role as the head of the Bolshevik Party. Mayakovsky writes, quote, "When we say Lenin, we mean the party, and when we say party, we mean Lenin," unquote. Soviet propensity for cults of personality began with Lenin, but it did not end with Lenin. Indeed, Lenin's legacy helped to continue the cults of personality. When many think of Soviet totalitarianism, many automatically think of the person of Joseph Stalin. It is well known that Stalin established a cult of personality around himself. But what is often forgotten is that Stalin utilized the legacy of Lenin to come to and justify his power. Vladimir Tismanu observes that, quote, "In fact, the struggle between Stalin and his arch-rival Trotsky revolved around the crucial question, who can legitimately claim to be today's Lenin," unquote. Though Stalin claimed legitimacy from the legacy of Lenin, he ultimately constructed a cult of personality all of his own. In exercising his will and holding close Lenin's standards for a party line, Stalin purged anyone who opposed him and shaped Soviet society and the Communist Party around himself. Quote, Stalin managed to become synonymous with the party itself, unquote. Stalin's will was treated as the same as the will of the party, and by extension, the will of the proletariat and the will of the Soviet nation. Stalin was the central figure, prominent in all propaganda, a symbol of both communism as an ideology and a symbol of Soviet pride and strength. Quote, even his cult of personality functioned as a unifying mechanism, a personification of socialist state building, unquote. The image of Stalin could be found everywhere and was treated with reverent awe. A Soviet worker wrote of this obsession with Stalin in his journal in 1936. Quote, the portraits of party leaders are now displayed the same way icons used to be, a round portrait framed and attached to a pole. Very convenient, hoisted onto your shoulder and you're on your way. And all these preparations are just like what people used to do before church holidays. They had their own activists then, we have ours now. Different paths, the same old folderol, unquote. Stalin and Lenin, among other communist figures, were treated with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Stalin could do no wrong. Indeed, anyone who challenged Stalin in any way was tantamount to challenging the hand of history itself. To challenge Stalin was to challenge the communist utopia of the future, populated with its new men. Only Stalin and his precepts could guide the Soviet Union toward a happier future. Stalin could solve any riddle and overcome any challenge. Quote, the solutions to all disturbing questions could be found in Stalin's writings, and those who failed to discover the answers were branded enemies of the people, unquote. Of course, with the silencing of dissent and the widespread propaganda, it is difficult to ascertain just how many people truly believed in the cult of Stalin and how many people merely went along to stay alive. A bitter comment from an anonymous communist official in 1938 reveals much about the attitude toward the cult. This anonymous person wrote in a note discovered in the Soviet archives, quote, do you not think that Comrade Stalin's name has begun to be very much abused? For example, Stalin's People's Commissar, Stalin's Canal, Stalin's Harvest, Stalin's 5-year plan, Stalin's Constitution, Stalin's youth organizations. I could give 100 other examples, even of little meaning. Everything is Stalin, Stalin, Stalin. You only have to listen to a radio program about our achievements, and every 5th or 10th word will be the name of Comrade Stalin. In the end, this sacred and beloved name, Stalin, may make so much noise in people's heads that it is very possible that it will have the opposite effect, unquote. It is difficult to know how many people legitimately believed in the Stalin's cult of personality. What can be said, however, is that it was extremely dangerous to openly disbelieve, or even to be perceived to have doubts about the cult. The Stalinist cult did not just pervade the Soviet Union. The Red Army spread the cult around Eastern Europe. The communist satellites in Eastern Europe had the Stalinist variant of communism imposed upon them forcibly. These smaller nations, at the behest of the USSR, attempted to copy the larger communist superpower. They copied the Soviet Union in almost every way, especially in their cults of personality and devotions to communist leaders. However, such cults were only allowed insofar as they did not interfere with the Stalinist cult. Tismanu observes, quote, within the countries of the Soviet bloc, party leaders would be allowed to enjoy the adoration of their subordinates, but their cults were only echoes of the true faith, unswerving love for Stalin, unquote. Even the communist nations outside of the Soviet orbit engaged in these cults of personality. In Yugoslavia, for instance, a cult of personality developed around the personage of Josip Broz Tito. Arguably, part of the reason for the conflict between the USSR and Yugoslavia could be traced to these dueling cults of personality. Stalin's cult of personality was so pervasive that it took years of effort for the Soviet Union to even attempt to rehabilitate itself. This process of de-Stalinization began under Khrushchev. Khrushchev gave a speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, openly denouncing Stalin and his various crimes. Khrushchev told the assembly in part, quote, "When we analyze the practice of Stalin in regard to the direction of the party and of the country, when we pause to consider everything which Stalin perpetrated, we must be convinced that Lenin's fears were justified. The negative characteristics of Stalin, which, in Lenin's time, were only incipient, transformed themselves during the last years into a grave abuse of power by Stalin, which caused untold harm to our party." Unquote. There are a few ironies that ought to be noted. This speech is known as the secret speech, precisely because it was secret. It was never publicly published nor acknowledged until 1989. For another thing, Khrushchev gave this speech in 1956, 3 full years after Stalin's death. For a third thing, Khrushchev, in denouncing Stalin, is actively invoking the legacy of Lenin. In denouncing a cult of personality, Khrushchev is utilizing a separate cult of personality to do so. Furthermore, Khrushchev does not actually denounce the actions Stalin took, i.e., mass deportations, murder, slavery, torture, etc. But rather, he is denouncing that Stalin was doing these things at his own discretion and often targeting party members. The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations were not the only ones to have engaged in cults of personality. These cults cropped up in the Asian communist states as well. Mao Zedong built up his own cult of personality, building his reputation on being a nationalist freedom fighter against the Japanese. Published in 1964, the charismatic Mao's Little Red Book became an instant bestseller. Quote, "It became virtually mandatory to own and carry one," unquote. Like Stalin, Mao could do no wrong and represented the will of the workers and the peasants. Ho Chi Minh, likewise, had his own cult of personality, though likely the most well-known cult of personality in East Asia would be that of the Kim family in North Korea. From the very beginning of the communist movement in North Korea, and likely due to the influence of the Soviet Union, there were seeds of a cult of personality. Portraying himself as a nationalist hero fighting against foreign imperialism, Kim Il-sung cemented his personality at the center of North Korean politics. Kim Il-sung once said in a speech that, quote, "Loyalty to the leader is loyalty to the party, and that is loyalty to the interests of society," unquote. Besides mere rhetoric from a particular leader, the Führer principle was established directly in the Communist Party's doctrines. Article 7 of North Korea's reads, quote, "Party's 10 principles in the drive toward unity. We must impose the absolute authority of our leader," unquote. This cult of personality continued after Kim Il-sung's death, was even transposed onto his son, Kim Jong-il. North Korean propaganda often refers to Kim Jong-il as dear leader, respected leader, intelligent leader. Interestingly, in North Korea, the mystique of the leader passes from father to son. After Kim Jong-il died, the mantle of the cult was placed on the shoulders of Kim Jong-un. Nearly every communist regime established cults of personality around those in leadership positions, or even martyrs of their revolutions. These cults of personality are so pervasive But the fact that Cambodia did not engage in this behavior is a key distinction between that regime and others. Otherwise, all these leaders believed that they, quote, could personify the will of the proletariat, unquote. They believed that they could lead the people into a new and happier world, that they could reshape the human character towards their own ends. Most of these communist leaders and ideologues were filled with, quote, utopian hubris, unquote. Both the communist and the fascist regimes believed in the Führerprinzip, a, quote, policy of dedication to and obedience of, unquote, the leader. While in theory, communism as an ideology rejected cults of personality, and it was a key aspect of fascist theory, nevertheless, in practice, the communist regimes and their cults of personality are easily comparable to the fascists. It is yet another way in which the two are incredibly like one another.